Thanks everyone for coming here today, and thanks for the speakers that have been before me. I suppose I'm probably one of the bad guys that was mentioned by Dr. Sophie Lewis. I'm a greenfields developer. My background is a landscape architect, so fortunately within the development business, I'm at least in the development business and have a chance to influence what developers like Ginninderry do. To give you a bit of background, and it's not a sell job on how good Ginninderry is, but I think it will set up for you the scale of the impact that greenfields developers like ourselves can make on the landscape. You can see here the white line outlines the development area of Ginninderry. This little orange section here is the first bit of the suburb that you drove in or you walked into here today. So you can see the scale is quite massive. We will be, it's the size of this area here plus a little bit more. So you've got your Holt, your Higgins, McGregor, bit of Dunlop. So it's a really big development, 1,600 hectares. You can see the master plan here, and here's some of the interesting fast facts of the development. Our total area is that whole area. It's 1,600 hectares or thereabouts. 1,000 hectares of that is developable land, so where houses will be, where parks will be, where roads will be. 596 hectares of that is land that we've dedicated to a conservation reserve or a conservation corridor which runs along the Murrumbidgee and along Ginninderry Creek.
How many hectares, sorry?
596, so almost 600 hectares. The whole reason that is there is, from an ecological basis, the first step that the project took was to look at its 1,600 hectares of land and work out what was important for biodiversity to establish. And so this boundary line that separates the development and the conservation corridor was the first step taken in the master plan. It wasn't we want to get 7 suburbs and 15,000 homes. It was how we can best protect the environment that we're sitting in, which in itself is an unusual step for a greenfields developer to take. It obviously protects quite an important landscape, both from a biodiversity point of view and a landscape point of view and a visual point of view. But more importantly, it protects a landscape that is incredibly fragile and has a high cultural significance within this region, within the Ngunnawal land that Wally looks after. Very high cultural significance through that whole corridor. 11,500 dwellings, so it's a 30 to 40 year development. So you can see if we just took the typical developer approach, which probably a lot of you think is just to make money and to sell houses, then we could probably fit a lot more than 11,500 homes on this landscape. That would probably have a lot more damage on the landscape than probably we should have. 4 suburbs, there'll be 4 schools in here. There's going to be a major market centre, a major shopping precinct, recreation, sports and community facilities. I don't know if many of you know much about this land around here, but there's this big rubbish tip right in the middle of this landscape, 106 hectares of the Parkwood rubbish and recycling estate. That's a major degraded landscape, if you like, that is now, we've got the opportunity to bring that back to something that's more valuable for the biodiversity in this region. And of course, where we make our money, traditional blocks, townhouses, terraces and apartments. So lots of living options for people all like us to come and live in this environment and in this landscape. This gives you a little bit of a visual impact of how big it is and the impact we can make. If you look out onto this landscape at the moment, I think it was duly mentioned, this is a farmed landscape, and Cormac said this is not a natural landscape that we're dealing in here. And when we arrived here, and this is going to be hard to think, on this 1,600 hectares of land, in the ACT portion of the land, there's about 90 living existing trees only. A lot of dead trees, but about 90 living existing trees. And that's in about half our area. That's in about 900 or almost 1,000 hectares of land. There's 90 trees, and then we go to the farming use of the landscape. So when you consider that, greenfields development in this environment is potentially not the worst thing in the world. Just to give you an idea of the time frame and how it all works and the how land development goes. This is this first little suburb that we're sitting in today, and that's developed around about now, and we've already got about 200 people living here. And you can see over a period of time the impact this landscape can have, and from my point of view as the landscape manager, the impact we can have on the biodiversity of this landscape. And we think the improvement we can have on this landscape. So whilst a lot of people will say, well, we're losing this beautiful green space, we think we can improve not only the green space, but we can vastly improve the biodiversity of this particular landscape through the work that we're going to do here. This is a bit of the sell part of the project, but it's kind of important to understand why we're taking the approach that we're taking. The project's developing what we want to, create a sustainable community of international significance in the capital region. To do that, we've got a series of principles that are guiding what we do. We want to partner with a lot of people, and that probably isn't an unusual step for a developer. That's kind of normal. It helps us get things approved. It helps us improve what we're doing. Evaluation principles, that's pretty standard. You go out and you evaluate everything that you own, and that gives you a good direction on what you're going to do. Ecological principles, this is probably one of the unusual ones that a developer may not necessarily take. If you're developing an apartment block in the middle of the town, you're not necessarily worrying too much about the ecology, although that is changing with a lot of developers in brownfields areas. But ecological principles particularly important for us in this environment. One of our selling aspects of this environment here is the environment. It's the views, it's the connection to nature, and some of you may have seen or heard some of our recent adverts on radio or TV, and they're people being interviewed about what's important about living at Ginninderry. And all of them, unscripted, it's their stories, are saying it's the environment, and it's the views, and it's the connection to nature, and it's the ability to get out and walk in the landscape and enjoy that landscape. And that's pretty important, and that's been a big shift in land development over the last 20 years. 20 years ago, it was all about getting houses on the ground and getting them as close together, and there's many bad examples of that. But now people want more out of that landscape. They want to understand what's happening in their suburb. They want to understand why it's important to do certain things in their suburb. This type of approach and this type of concept of thinking of that, it starts to help everyone in the process of land development, from the developers to the people like Cormac who advise developers, to the people like Rachel who manage our forests, and Wayne who manages the handover of those sort of things. So it's starting to help all of those people come together a little bit more in the process. It's no longer bad guy versus good guy. It's people working together to deliver something for the community. Social and cultural principles are important to this project. And again, a lot of people talk about that, but it's how you do it and how you implement that. And it's starting to listen to people. It's starting to understand the culture of the site. It gives us another selling potential as well. When people understand where they're living, when they take ownership of where they're living, they start to enjoy their environment a lot more. They start to help look after the environment a lot more. So that is a really big part of this project as well, is getting people involved, getting people to understand the importance of things like pollinator corridors. And for us, pollinator corridors are important, but the general biodiversity is as important, because that's the cornerstone to developing everything that we want to do. Economic principles, that's our main goal, obviously. That's every developer's main goal. But, you know, those principles set us up for the objectives, and our objectives are, you know, they're not unusual, but they actually mean something to us as a team of people. We've got about 26, 27 staff who work on this project. Be sustainable over time, socially, economically and ecologically. And, you know, they're pretty, economically that's an obvious one for a developer, but generally developers, you know, you wouldn't associate us with socially and ecologically. And I think that's an important change. Respond to local and global environment, provide for future beneficial change, be cost effective, replicable and measurable, and act as a new model for others to follow. So what we're doing to improve biodiversity, which we see as the cornerstone for the pollinators, is our conservation corridor, 600 hectares of land, big program of improvement through there, weed control and rehabilitation and restoration of the landscape. Water sensitive urban design, we're doing a network of water ponds that will all be linked, hopefully all be linked one day, and hopefully used to reuse water through the whole landscape. And often, you know, water sensitive urban design's been a very popular catchphrase over the last couple of years, but the actual reuse of that water hasn't been as well done as it can be. So Ginninderry, ultimately in this master plan you can see on there, there's something like 30 or 40 ponds that will be connected and reuse water. Already we've got 3 ponds connected, which is about 32 megalitres of water just in this first neighbourhood. And we're hoping, as you drove in, you can see it's quite green. All of that water at the moment, that's the plan, is that water will go back into the landscape and keep, for a number of reasons, that keeps the landscape cool, it promotes growth, improves visual appreciation of the landscape. There's so many benefits to reusing that water. Retention of existing trees. We've retained over 80% so far. The next neighbourhood that we've just put in for a DA, we're trying to retain 100% of those trees, and one of our consultants working on that red box is talking a little bit later. Establishment of biodiversity parklands. So we've got a mix of parklands at Ginninderry. We've got the beautiful kick the football around parks, we've got the playgrounds, but we've also, working with TCCS, we're trying to establish biodiversity parklands, which is the existing trees, which are mainly planted underneath, not big green spaces to mow, not slides and purple equipment in them, but primarily just to increase this biodiversity within the neighbourhood. That's a challenge for us in establishing it. It's also a challenge for TCCS in accepting the asset and managing the asset. So it sounds small, but it's quite a big undertaking from all parties involved. Establishment of an open space network. So that's over 20% of our development area, so not including the corridor, is open space. So it'd probably end up around 23, 25%. But that, you know, that's a big commitment as well. Every hectare we can put 20 houses on it. That makes us quite a bit of money. But from a development point of view, we don't see the value in that if we're going to be looking after this land and making this a sustainable suburb. Revegetation of the landscape. So in the bit that you've just driven through, some quick facts. We've planted over 1,700 trees and planted over 110,000 of this mid-tier and ground cover plant species. All designed, we think, to promote pollination and biodiversity. We think probably not as successful as we would like it to be in Neighbourhood 1 in Strathnan, and we're hoping through the work with Redbox in Neighbourhood 2 that it'll be a lot more successful than it has been or is. Rehabilitation of the 100 hectares of the Parkwood tip. The main idea of that rehabilitation is to bring the landscape back in there and bring, so when you think of 100 hectares, that's a lot of plant material, a lot of pollination, a lot of biodiversity that we can create there. We're delivering front gardens for residents, again, promoting this importance of growing things in your front garden, not just having gravel or grass to mow, but trying to promote to people within this environment and hopefully a bit more broadly the importance of plants. We're looking at urban agriculture and community gardens on some of our bigger land holdings like the Parkwood Tip site, again to just bring to the forefront of people's minds that local production is good, but to do local production you need this biodiversity, you need this variety in your landscape. And community education and ownership. So we've taken on a big role as trying to educate the community and bring them along with us. We're doing that through a number of ways: direct interaction with homeowners who come here, working with governments, working with universities, working with partners like Act for Bees on trying to educate everyone who lives here on the importance of what environment they're living in and how they can improve that environment. I've got the wind up, so I'm going to run through this. This is my favourite page. It touches on something that Cormac said about the colours of the pollinators, and I don't know if any of you have known, but biodiversity, and a lot of the pollinators start with bee as well. So you've got birds, bees, bats, butterflies. So yeah, I thought that was kind of cool. The challenges to improve biodiversity are also, they're all around a lot of the things that we're trying to do. So the establishment of the conservation corridor, it sounds easy, give over 600 hectares of land to someone. Well, we've got to give it to the ACT government or the New South Wales government or the Yass Valley Council. So it's actually a trust that manages it on behalf of those three bodies. So, getting three levels of government and a developer to all work together was kind of interesting. Design approvals. There is a couple of our government colleagues here today, and whilst it is quite a difficult process, say 10 years ago, the change in government and in developers in working together to improve what we're doing and to improve the diversity of, say, plant lists and trees and what trees need to survive has, I would say, vastly improved over the last 10 years since I've been working specifically on greenfields developments. Selection of plant species, which Redbox is going to talk about later, that's always a challenge. This is a challenging environment to live and work in. It's harsh at both ends of the scale, heat and cold. There isn't that many beautiful flowering plants, but there is a lot of flowering plants locally. I think beautiful is roses, right? That's what everyone thinks. Roses are beautiful and they're these big flowers. But, there is a lot of variety actually when you look more closely at what's available in plants in this region. One of the things that we are trying to do, and Julie touched on, is this 3 tiers of planting. And as a landscape architect, that's how I was brought up, is 3 tiers of planting. That's the best design you can do. And now it's becoming more important to look at how we design those 3 tiers of planting. Enriching of the soil is vitally important. We plant a tree, we do nothing, it dies, doesn't get replaced, it's just a disaster. So we actually do a lot of work in not only how we treat the soil out here, how we prepare the soil, but we work with the nurseries who grow the trees. We work with that whole range of people to see if we can get the survival of that tree or that plant to be a lot better. And it starts right at the soil. Water back into the landscape, I mentioned, that's vitally important. This variety of species is important, and I'll touch on it in my next slide, but I'll go through why that variety is important. Biodiversity of the parklands beneath the existing trees. This is a real challenge for us. It sounds easy, and it sounds like you just go and plant natives and the world's a great place. But it is really hard to get some of this native seed established to a point that it's not only valuable for biodiversity, but valuable for the community. And it's got to be valuable for the community, otherwise it'll get mowed over and it'll be a standard parkland. Because no one wants weeds or no one wants snakes living next door to them, and the perception, however wrong or right it is that if it's weedy and it's tall, that's snakes and that's rats, and you can't have that in urban development. And maintenance. This is, of all of these great things, maintenance is the most difficult thing. And it's getting people on board with living next door to something that maybe doesn't meet their requirements of beautiful or well maintained or safe. And that's a challenge for TCCS as much as it is a challenge for us. So what we're trying to do, and what we think the way we will take this forward in planning any new development that we do, is these 5 or 6 things will be how we will approach it. We're working on a 200 by 200 metre grid across our whole development area. This is our next neighbourhood, McNamara, which has just gone in for a DA application. The 200 by 200 metre grid is a principle we set up with Redbox because that's the native bees' flying range. We know that the big old honeybee can handle pretty much the whole suburb. We're looking at a 200 by 200 metre grid, so that we're using that to say to us, in that grid, do we have a variety of plant species within that 200 by 200? Is there a variety of flowering seasons in that 200 by 200? And if not, is there something in that grid next door or just over the little border? So that, I suppose that's a good control and a good checkpoint for us. We're trying to develop a strong green spine. We do all the great things that we have to for TCCS approval, which is have a roadway which is so wide and verges which are so wide. But we're also looking at this, trying to establish through the whole of the development a green spine that's connected all the way through both north-south and east-west, so that we can get to the conservation corridor, both visually and physically, and we can move people and pollinators through the landscape in a safer way. A lot of the pollinators, like the little birds, they like to jump and they like to hide in bushes, and we've got to have that environment there for them. They like to sit on the ground. Birds don't all like to sit up in trees and just hang up in there. We're planning for a diversity of landscape types. So we're going to have the urban parklands. We want to look at this concept of a foraging street with our designers and with our TCCS, where maybe we're promoting people going out and looking after a street which is immediately outside their house, but they've got this chance to maybe plant a bit more of a productive landscape. Biodiverse parklets, which I mentioned before, these green links, which I mentioned, the natural buffers and the vegetated streets. So again, we're looking for a bit more of a diversity of the tree plantings in some of those streets. Some of our streets, some of the colleagues here today will see on our application that we're trying to do streets that maybe have 2 different tree species in them instead of 1. And again, 10 years ago that would have been thrown out, but now we've got the chance that maybe that is becoming viable. And it's looking at different sizes in trees, and it's trying to cool the landscape, trying to get more canopy in the landscape, and trying to get more diversity in the landscape. Water in the landscape is important for us. I've gone through a little bit of that, and that's an obvious one for everyone. We do heat studies on the landscape, and when you put a heat study over the landscape, the best thing for keeping it cool is trees. The next best thing is irrigated grass. The next best thing after that is concrete, which is better than dry grass and hot earth. Increased shade in the landscape and improving permeability. So this is improving permeability is a big thing because it allows our trees to grow a lot better, allows our landscape to grow a lot better. And looking at techniques for that is difficult as well. There's a lot of challenges to that because streets, paths are important, bike lanes are important. All of these things are hard, and you've got to get tree roots under them, and you've got to get tree roots shading them. And if you put a tree 10 metres away from a road, it doesn't provide much shade on the biggest heat source in the urban environment, which is the black asphalt. So really, a lot of our work is targeting trying to get those trees as close as we can to the roads. And of course, you've got a lot of engineers who say roads, they're off limits. You can't even drop a tree a leaf on a road because it goes down the stormwater drain, and that creates issues. And so, you know, there's a lot of challenges to this, but you know, that's our approach, and that's where we think we can make a big difference to this landscape, a greenfields landscape which we don't think is particularly diverse. We don't think it's particularly great for pollinators, and you can see if we do 1,800 trees in this first neighbourhood, we're doing, I think it's 10 neighbourhoods roughly. So you're looking at probably a landscape that we think's got about 90, let's double it, let's call it 200 trees, existing trees, and we'll end up putting somewhere around 18,000 trees back into this landscape, and however many millions of shrubs, ground covers and plants that increase the biodiversity of the landscape. So that's me done.